So, what I realized is the amount of risk that is posed by our information outside of our four walls is significantly greater than the risk posed by one that we ended up sharing with some third party through the course of doing business than that which actually exists within our own four walls. So important to have a good security program at Highmark Health, but probably more important for us to have a phenomenal strategy for ensuring that our members' information, our patients' information is just as secure when it leaves our four walls as when it is inside our four walls. So today I'm going to talk about a few different things. First, I'm going to talk about the third-party risk program at Highmark Health and what it looked like, what the before view of third-party risk looked like. Then I'll talk about what approach we took to solve things from a third-party risk management standpoint, and then where did we end up as a result of that. So before we built out the third-party risk program at Highmark Health, we applied some very specific criteria to figure out how to construct that program, and the criteria fell into three categories: effectiveness, efficiency, and coverage. So what we'll do for most of this afternoon is we'll actually walk through what that criteria was, and on a spectrum where Highmark fell compared to where we wanted to be, and then we'll talk about where we actually ended up against that same criteria. Okay. So the first thing that we looked at is the effectiveness, and under effectiveness we cared about the credibility of the control framework. So if we are going to our third parties, and so maybe I'll pause here for a second just to introduce some terminology. So I will use the words third party, maybe even vendor, and business associate interchangeably. That means, or service provider. Those are folks that you're paying money to give you some kind of a service, and as part of that interaction, you are sharing confidential information with them. So third party, business associate, vendor, service provider, I'm going to use synonymously for the purposes of this session. The converse of that, I'm going to use the company, the organization, the enterprise, the covered entity, or the relying party. All of those represent the organization that's paying money to someone else to deliver services to them. So if me, as the relying party, as the organization that's receiving services, is now going to a third party and saying, I want you to have these security controls implemented, and if you have these controls implemented, we're going to feel like you're doing a good job protecting our information. How credible is the set of controls that I'm giving to that third party? Is it homegrown within the enterprise, which would put it on the low end of the spectrum, or is it some globally accepted standard across all industries that I could share with them? And if so, that would end up being high on the spectrum. So every slide I'm going to show you is going to have low, it's going to have high, and we're going to talk about the prior state, where was Highmark on this spectrum, and where is the desired state. In an ideal world, where would we like to be? Does that make sense? So we had a homegrown set of questions that someone came up with before I joined the organization and said, we're going to tell everyone they have to live up to these compliance requirements. The next thing that we care about is the selection of the required controls. So how do you decide out of these 20 or 30 or 100 or 300 or 3,000 controls, which of them are applicable to the third party in any given specific situation? Because is every control applicable in every situation, in every context? No. You have to be able to determine which set of controls, and on the low end of effectiveness, you can have something that's completely open interpretation. So you get to decide whatever you want. I could do something like HIPAA says, which is administrative, technical, and physical controls. And you get to decide what constitutes administrative, technical, and physical control, and one person could decide that means 10 controls, and another person could decide that means 1,000 controls. It's completely open to interpretation, versus the other side is it's very explicitly prescribed with absolutely no deviations permitted. So a good example of something on the left side is SOC 2. In SOC 2, it is a reporting framework. It is not a control framework. Management gets to decide what controls you want to put into the SOC 2. Now, the AICPA has some basic requirements, but I, as management, can decide. For us, a strong password is 4 digits. And that's what I decided, and I can bring in an AICPA firm to then attest that those controls are in place. And AICPA firm isn't necessarily going to say, I've got good or bad security. They're just going to say that I have the controls in place that I said that I have in place. It's up to me to decide what those controls are. It's completely open interpretation. Whereas on the other side, you can have something like the PCI DSS, the data security standard, which is obligatory for anyone that processes credit cards. In that case, they've got a set of 12 requirements, not very open to deviations, and everyone has to implement exactly those requirements. If you're small, if you're large, that is the set of requirements. So in our prior state, we said, here's the requirements. It doesn't matter if you're a small BA with 3 employees or if you're a large BA with 150,000 employees, the requirements are all exactly the same. Does that make sense? Probably not. Does it make sense to be on the low end of the spectrum? Probably not. You don't want to give too much flexibility. You don't want to give too little flexibility. Where we wanted to be was right in the middle. The next thing that we looked at was the efficacy of control validation. This is basically saying, how do we know if those controls are actually implemented? On the low end of the spectrum, we're saying we do nothing. As we move a little bit further out, we're saying, hey, we've got a self-assessment questionnaire. So our vendor, our third party, our business associate completes a questionnaire that we send to them, and they choose to fill it out in the way that they would like to fill it out. And then you've got contractual language for all third parties. So we got the lawyers involved, we've got procurement involved, and we contractually obligated a third party to put all of those controls in place. On the high end, we actually have an evidentiary review of policies and validation of every single control, and then there's some stuff in the middle. How many of you have ever sent a questionnaire or received one? Okay, most of you. So if you received a questionnaire and on the questionnaire it said something like, which pretty much every questionnaire I've ever seen says this, do you encrypt data at rest? And if I told you I had a flash drive that I encrypted last year, could I answer yes to that question? Yes. So how valuable is a questionnaire? It's extremely open to interpretation, and when you respond, it's very difficult to provide valuable information and accurate information, and it's not because people are necessarily being malicious or they're being elusive, but it's just that the questionnaire only has a certain level of efficacy and capability that it can deliver. We know from some of the reviews of self-assessment questionnaires and then subsequent comparison to the on-site assessments that the average questionnaire, the accuracy of an average questionnaire is somewhere around 50 to 60%. So 40 to 50% of information in the average questionnaire is incorrect. Yet there is such an extreme reliance on questionnaires in the healthcare industry and other industries as well. Why do you think we like questionnaires? We all know, especially for those of you that are paranoid security professionals, we all know in our heart of hearts that questionnaires are not very useful. Yet we continue to use them and we continue to promote them. And the reason is very simple. It's because it's easy. I could create a questionnaire and I can send it out to 100 of my BAs. It may take me 2 days to do that. Versus if I had to go on site and painstakingly validate every single control, that does not feel like something viable. It does not feel practical. So I'm probably not going to do it, and I'll stick to the left-hand side of the spectrum. That's where we were. Where would we like to be? On the other side of the spectrum. Because that's when we start to see real information and we start to see real data, and we can actually trust it and we're actually following the data. The last thing that we looked at from an effectiveness standpoint was the upkeep of the control framework. Have things changed in the cyber world in the last 5 years, in the last 4 years, in the last 3 years, in the last year? How was life in the world of cybersecurity prior to Bitcoin? Did we deal with things like ransomware as much? Do we deal with it now? Do we feel like our control framework needs to keep up with it and should be updated at cyber speed? Probably. So on the low end is there's no schedule whatsoever. Whenever everyone agrees, we make a change. And that's where we were at. We had a set of questions that we gave to all of our business associates. And when I asked, how often do we review it and update it? Well, not really. It's just John put it together 3 years ago, and that's that. Well, I think things have changed in the last 3 years. I think things have changed in the last year. We probably should have updated that. Where would we like to be? There should be a regular cadence that's commensurate with evolving risk. And if things are changing slowly, maybe it's okay if it gets updated every 2 years. If things are changing fast, maybe it should change every year. So PCI DSS, I believe, changes every 2 years. ISO 27000, I think, changes every 5 or 6 or 7 years. NIST changes every 4 or 5 years. Does it feel like those standards are changing at the same pace as the cyber risks are evolving? That's a question you have to ask for your specific organization. The second theme that we said we would address is that of efficiency. So this was the question that I believe Mike asked around cost. And so who should bear the cost? Is it the third party that you see on the x-axis, or is it the enterprise, the relying party, the customer, on the y-axis? So this is how it worked for us, is most of the cost was to the enterprise. We bore most of the cost to make sure that our third party was secure, which quite honestly seems backward. Wait, if I'm paying you money to deliver a service, why should I pay even more money to make sure you're delivering it properly? You should be able to demonstrate to me in a compelling, credible, and believable way that you are adequately protecting my data. It should not be more effort on my part to buy services from you. You're just making this a much worse customer experience for me. Where would we like it to be? In the bottom left corner. We want the cost to us to be low as the enterprise. We also want the cost to the business associate, to the third party, to be low. Why do you think that is? Why wouldn't I just have said, hey, I want the cost of the enterprise to be low, and I want all of the costs to go to the business associate?
Because you're going to end up paying for it anyway.
You'll end up paying for it anyway.
It's a managed cost problem for everybody.
Somehow it'll end up coming back to you anyway. Imagine, one of the questions I asked is how many of you are business associates and how many of you are enterprises? So for those of you, so each of you are probably thinking one thing right now. If you're a business associate or a vendor, you're thinking the enterprise should pay it. And if you're an enterprise, you're thinking the business associate should pay it. And for all of you, you're probably 100% certain of who should pay it. But here's the reality. The goal isn't to stick it to the other person or the other entity. The goal is to figure out how we can fix the ecosystem, because the problem is one of the ecosystem and the rules of the road that we've established that don't make any sense, and we've entered into conflict, and we've created an environment, as we'll see in the next slide, where there is an enormous amount of waste. Third-party risk programs, probably 90 to 95% of the money that's spent on third-party risk programs is avoidable. We don't really get much security out of it.
One comment on it. It seems to me, and this is what I'm hearing from my customers, that this challenge is an after-the-fact challenge from a cost standpoint. So, it's like, here's increased cost for doing business with us after you've already priced your service maybe over a multi-year, however it may be working. So I think that's something that's problematic, and I think you're hitting to what.
Yeah.
what needs to be
Yeah, I mean,
addressed there.
there should be some level of transparency. You don't want to do the bait and switch. That's probably not, if you're a business associate, you probably don't feel good operating a business like that. If you're a customer, you probably don't feel good being serviced as a customer in that way. So that's something that all of us would probably want to avoid. So here's my reality. On the one hand, I was receiving all of these questionnaires, and typical organization our size, it is not uncommon for us to receive a few hundred requests for questionnaires to be completed. It is not uncommon for us to receive a couple of hundred on-site audits to support and to provide SMEs for. But on the other hand, what else are we doing? We're receiving these questionnaires from our customers, and we're also sending these questionnaires to our third parties. So on the one hand, I have my teams coming to me and complaining about this questionnaire that was taken from the SIG, and it's 1,700 questions, and it's such a waste of time. On the other hand, that same team is the one that's sending out questionnaires that don't look much less onerous than that one to hundreds of our third parties as well. And I'm like, do you realize what you're complaining about on here is exactly what you're doing on the other side? So we're both on the give and we're on the take side of it. So it's in my best interest to solve this such that both win. Because if one wins and the other loses, that means I still lose. And the reality is, for almost 100% of you, you have customers, and for almost 100% of you have customers and you have providers, because that's the way the supply chain works. You've got folks that are upstream from you, your suppliers, and you've got folks that are downstream from you, your customers. And so you want to create an ecosystem where everyone wins and not just one half of the equation wins. And so here's the next piece of it. So this goes to the point that I was making earlier, and out of the 10 criteria that we're going to review, this to me is probably the one that I have personally the most visceral reaction against. So we're going to look at two things here. So on the x-axis, we're going to look at the variety of control requirements across relying parties. So, and on the y-axis, we'll look at the alignment across testing efforts. So low variety of control requirements would mean that all relying parties have identical control requirements. So if there's 5 customers that you're providing services to, we're saying all 5 of those customers give you the exact same set of requirements. That would mean low variety of control requirements. A high variety of control requirements would mean each of your 5 customers has different expectations in terms of how you should keep their information secure. The reality is, if you're delivering services, the same service to 5 customers, you should be able to identify a common baseline set of controls that you deliver that meets the needs of all 5 customers. The way that the industry behaves today is that every customer feels like they're different and they're special. And that simply is not true if you actually look at the data. The other thing that we look at is, now that we've identified the control requirements, we care about the testing of the control requirements, because I will tell you, as a paranoid security person, I don't really care if you've signed a contract that says anything until you prove to me that you've implemented the controls. My blood pressure is probably not going to go down, right? And so how do you do that testing? So a low alignment across testing efforts would mean that each relying party conducts its own test. So if I've said, here are the 5 requirements that I'm going to meet that you have given me, do each of my 5 customers now come on site and validate those same requirements one by one, review the same policies, talk to the same SMEs, review the same firewall logs? Or are they saying, hey, 16 other healthcare payers already looked at this information. Maybe we don't have to be the 17th one to ask you the exact same information. How many of you have multiple audits in a given year? How often do you get asked something unique that you weren't asked in the previous 3 or 5 or 10 audits? Are you just answering the same question over and over again? Yes, someone is reviewing the video camera footage. Yes, we have backups. Yes, we store them for this long. Yes, we store them at a secure location in New Jersey. Yes, we do this. Yes, we do this. And it's the same thing over and over and over again. And after you've expended that amount of time with the auditor, if it was with your customer, you could make the case that, hey, we're building a relationship and we're improving confidence with the customer and that's worthwhile. But the reality is, it's very seldom your customer that's showing up on site for those audits. They're actually have hired some consulting firm that's sending some auditor on site to do that review. So it's not really helping you build your relationship with your customer either. And at the end of that exchange, at the end of that experience, you don't leave saying, wow, I made my customer happy. Or you don't leave saying, wow, I am so much more secure as a result of that experience. You leave typically saying, I can't believe we just spent 68 hours preparing for that one visit that didn't result in any gain in customer satisfaction, in delivering more customer value, or making us more secure. It just feels like everyone loses when we end up in the top left corner, which is or when we end up in the bottom left corner, everyone loses. Where we would like to be is in the top left corner, which is that there's not much duplication of testing efforts, and we would also like to end up where the amount of variety across the control requirements is minimal. So everyone's expecting similar requirements, and they're leveraging single testing effort versus 100 customers all coming in and looking at the same system and asking the same questions around it. Total waste of money. You could have used those other 99 assessments, the resources from that, to actually make yourself more secure instead of responding to 99 more questionnaires and audits with the exact same questions. Now, one piece of clarification I want to make here is that this is referring to the control requirements, and it's referring to how you validate those control requirements. This is not saying that everyone should make the same decision, because I could review a set of deficient controls from organization X, and I could say that's acceptable to me. And my peer working for another company who also happens to be a customer could look at that exact same control deficiency and say, absolutely no way. I am going to recommend that we sever the relationship with this third party. They don't have good controls in place. So the decision, what you do with the information when you get it, it is 100% up to the enterprise. It is up to the relying party, because every enterprise has slightly different tolerance for risk depending on their business model. So we're not saying everyone should draw the same conclusions from the data. We're just saying everyone should get the same data and not have to expend additional effort to get it. Under efficiency, the next thing we care about is applicability across multiple industries and geographies. On the left-hand side, we have only applies to a specific organization. That's where we were at. On the right-hand side, we have some sort of set of control requirements that apply across all organizations, regardless of size, industry, and geography. At this point, I started to become slightly less utopian, and I said, you know what, if we ended up in the middle, that would probably be fine, because the reality is we're in healthcare, and I really need something that works for organizations that are within my ecosystem. I'm not really super concerned about what manufacturing or energy or media or the government does, because those aren't organizations that I'm dealing with on a regular basis. Last item under efficiency is the ease to implement. So are third parties subjected to bespoke requirements by each enterprise? So if every enterprise is sending out a 500-question questionnaire to their relying party, that doesn't feel like it's easy to implement. On the right-hand side, you have third parties are subject to consistent requirements across all industries. Again, trying not to be nearly as utopian, my desired state was to be somewhere in the middle, which is that third parties are subjected to consistent requirements, at least within the industry. So I was talking to one of the Fortune 10 technology vendors earlier this year, and they said, you know, we have this and we have this and we have this in terms of our certifications. And I said, but none of them work for healthcare. This is what you need to do for healthcare. And they said, yeah, but we have this and we have that. I'm like, well, that's fine, but it doesn't really work for me in healthcare. Give me something that works for me. And it's okay if you don't want to serve the healthcare industry, we can go to a different vendor. But I could tell you that this is the expectation within healthcare. Okay, from a scalability from a coverage standpoint, the first thing that we care about is how scalable is it? Because at the end of the day, if you have 1,000 vendors, which is not really uncommon, how do you make sure that that actually scales? And the way that we looked at it is we said, along the different types of control validation, how does it scale? In our prior state, we were doing no testing for for most of our customers. And then for about 25%, we were actually having them fill out a self-assessment questionnaire. And we had contractual language for all of them. And then for some small percentage, we were actually doing 1 week on-site audits. Where we'd like to be is doing no questionnaires, still keep the contractual language, do very few on-site interviews and validation, and move the majority, or move 100% to the point where we're doing evidentiary review of policies and validations of every single control. That is where we would like to get to in terms of our desired state. How many people have a formal third-party risk program in their organization that they're aware of? Okay. How many of you tier your third-party risk program? So you've got your tier 1 vendors, tier 2 vendors, tier 3 vendors, right? Almost all of you. So one of the things that I've seen, and when prior to joining Highmark, I was at Verizon, so I spent time working with a lot of enterprises. What I would find very common in enterprises is what they would do is they would tier the vendors based on the amount of money that they're spending with them. So if you had a large relationship with an organization, they would automatically end up in the top tier. If you had a small relationship with an organization in terms of the dollar value of the contract, they would end up in the bottom tier. Now, the reality is, from an information risk standpoint, that probably is the exact opposite way of doing it. Because the reality is, if you're working with you have a very large relationship, there's probably a greater chance it's with a larger organization that has a security program that is doing a lot of things. So for me to send someone on site to review Wells Fargo's security program, I'm not sure that that's the best use of my resources, because there's probably 450 organizations that came before me and asked the exact same questions that I would have. However, that small healthcare startup that we're just starting to pilot something with, and we decided to ship 1 million members information to, that has 0 security people that just started off in their garage, that's probably my number 1 risk. And they're not showing up in my model at the top, they're showing up at the bottom. And so it doesn't matter the size of the monetary relationship, it really matters. 2 things matter. How much information are you sending them, and how good are their security controls? So if there's one question I would want to ask my third party or anybody to determine how good of a security program they have, just one question, I'd say, how many people do you have that are dedicated to security? And if the answer is 0, I pretty much know they probably don't care about security as much. If the answer is 2 or 3, that's pretty good. And I'll tell you, the gap between 0 and 1 is huge. The moment you have 1 dedicated security person, the game totally changes. The leap from 1 to 20 is not nearly as much as the leap between 0 and 1 in terms of the risk reduction. The last thing that we looked at is rate of adoption. Because at the end of the day, we could have a great program, we could roll it out, and it could be the best program in the world, but if it doesn't get adoption, it doesn't really matter. It's not about coming up with the program, it's not about the idea, it's not about the approach, it's not about installing the program, it's all about realizing value from the program. And so adoption would depend on something like, on the low end, if your third parties are totally apathetic to control requirements, they're not going to go anywhere. They're not going to move. Adoption will likely be low. Where we would like to be is on the right-hand side, where third parties desire to adopt due to perceived value of the approach. So they see the value in it and they say, we want to do this, not we've been compelled to do this, we have to do this, we want to do it. We want to get this to desire rather than compulsion. That is where we would like to be. Okay, so what did we do? How did we roll out the program at Highmark? And then where did we end up against those criteria? So this is where I'm actually going to speed things up, because you've seen all the slides, but you're going to see them all one more time with one more sticker added, namely, where did we actually end up? And so before I talk about that, I'll take a second to talk about what approach we took. So we got together with 4 other healthcare payers, HCSC, United Healthcare Group, Anthem, and Humana, and we said, you know what? Why don't we all agree on an approach? Because if we do something individually, it's probably not going to be as effective as if we do something as a group, because then we'll actually be helping the industry versus adding more complexity. And so we all decided on 3 things. We're going to have our control requirements defined by the HITRUST Common Security Framework. We're going to have our controls must be validated by an approved HITRUST assessor, and our business associates must obtain a HITRUST CSF certification within 2 years. So every single one of those items was extremely deliberate. So the picture became prettier. So let's talk about where we ended up. So we ended up with the HITRUST CSF, which is the most widely adopted security framework is in the US healthcare industry. It's actually based on ISO 27001. There's about an 83 to 84% adoption rate for HITRUST CSF among healthcare payers and among healthcare providers, among healthcare business associates, and among pharma industry. The adoption rate isn't nearly as high, but among payers and providers, the hospitals, the adoption rate is pretty high. So we found something that had pretty high credibility in the healthcare industry, so it worked for that. It doesn't necessarily have credibility across all industries, but that's starting to change. The next thing we cared about is the selection of required controls. And the way that the HITRUST CSF works is it's a risk-based control framework, and it actually maps to 20 different compliance requirements and authoritative documents. So if you're concerned with NIST, you're concerned with some of the other CMS requirements, PCI, HIPAA, high tech, various state privacy laws, ISO 27001, NIST 800-53, NIST Cybersecurity Framework, FFIEC requirements, and probably about 8 or 10 others. HITRUST essentially harmonizes them. It doesn't come up with something new. It just takes a lot of those existing compliance requirements and build crosswalks against them. The one thing that it does that makes it fairly unique is it introduces something called risk factors. So the idea is if you're a smaller organization, you're only dealing with 50,000 protected health information records versus you're a large organization, you're dealing with 50 million protected health records. You're a small hospital with 20 beds, you're a big hospital with 300 beds, you're a global company that's doing business all over the world, you're a local company that's not doing business all over the world, you happen to be a contractor of CMS delivering business for Medicare and Medicaid, you're not doing it. All of those factor into determining what controls you have to abide by. So if your risk is high, regardless of whether you're small or large, you're going to end up with a higher set of control requirements. If your risk is low, you'll end up with a lower set of control requirements. So every single control, you actually determine what level you have to comply at. So for a password, you may have one organization may be able to get the checkbox for HITRUST by having a 6-character password. Another organization may have to have 2-factor authentication to meet the strong password requirement based on the risk factor. So it aligns and it sizes based on the actual context of the organization. Efficacy of control validation. In order to achieve the HITRUST certification, an approved CSF assessor must validate every single control, and the recertification happens every 2 years. Upkeep of the control framework, and I apologize that information hasn't been updated. We're in 2017. We're up to version 9 of the HITRUST CSF. Version 10 will be coming out next year. Every single year, consistently, HITRUST has updated the Common Security Framework based on feedback from the industry, from the auditors, from the assessors, from the government. And so it does evolve based on the needs of the industry. From a cost standpoint, we end up in the low section because enterprises avoid costs associated with on-site assessments, and the third party has to complete a single validation audit. So instead of a third party like us having to support 100 on-site audits for our customers to come on site, we just have to do one on-site audit every 2 years, and we share that information with all of our customers. From a waste standpoint, we're not exactly in the top left corner, but we significantly make it better because we do reduce the amount of testing efforts. So there's not nearly as much duplication of testing efforts. The testing is actually done once versus the testing being done multiple times. And the reason that it still appears in the low medium when it comes to the x-axis is because of the risk factors. So the risk factors mean one organization may have a slightly different set of controls than another organization. Applicability across multiple industries. The H in HITRUST stands for healthcare. So it is really focused on healthcare specifically, but it also gets some of the adjacent industries because of the work HITRUST did after about 2 years of effort working closely with the AICPA. And for those of you that know the AICPA, they are very, very meticulous, very detail-oriented, which is another way of saying they don't necessarily work very fast. And so after 2 years of working with the AICPA, they indicated that the HITRUST CSF controls were actually reasonable controls that could be used as part of the SOC 2 reporting framework as the control requirements in the SOC 2. And so now you can actually get a SOC 2 based on the HITRUST controls. So if I go to one of my customers that's in the financial services industry or manufacturing or energy, and I say to them, I've got a HITRUST certification, they'll look at me and they'll say, we don't even know what that is. Now I'll work to educate them, and over time, many of them understand what it is, and not only do they accept the certification, but I have one very large financial services customer that is a top 10 bank in the country that actually went and got HITRUST certified because they liked the framework so much. Financial services went and got HITRUST certified. And I said to them, you realize the H in HITRUST stands for healthcare and you're in financial services. They said, yes, but it works for us. Now, so when I go to them and say, hey, I've got a SOC 2 that's aligned to the HITRUST requirements, then they say, I know what a SOC 2 is, I will accept that. What I also tell them is you shouldn't just accept any SOC 2 because there's good SOC 2s and there's not so good SOC 2s. There's an organization I had the opportunity to work with where their salesperson had in a contract agreed to getting the organization SOC 2 certified. This was 3 years before the organization had any plans to go get a SOC 2. And so that gives you an idea of when you're working, when you're dependent on contractual requirements, how effective that is, because in this case, this organization told their customer, which happened to be one of the state governments, that they would go and get their SOC 2, and their compliance, legal, or their security team did not even know about this agreement that they had made to their customer, and the customer's thinking they're going to go get their SOC 2. They had to scramble, and they had to go get their SOC 2 a year before they planned to do it, and guess how long it took them to go get their SOC 2? 6 weeks. Why? Because it's a SOC 2. A SOC 2 is open to interpretation. I can give you a SOC 2 that's crap, or I can give you a SOC 2 that's awesome. So in this case, this same organization said, if my customer really wants something, I can turn something around in 6 weeks and meet their needs, and all they wanted was to check in the box. They got their SOC 2 done in 6 weeks without a single qualification. The reality is that organization did not feel like it had the right controls in there. And so a year later, they went and got their next SOC 2, and the controls that were in that SOC 2 were probably 10 times more effective at reducing risk than that initial SOC 2. That gives you an example of how good the SOC 2 is or isn't. The reality is most of your customers out there live and die by the SOC 2 and they'll accept it. Well, as organizations get savvier, they're going to start to say, well, wait a minute. What's inside the SOC 2? What does your control requirements look like? If it's based on something like the HITRUST or some other well-curated and well-thought-out set of controls, then that's great. If not, then that's going to be questionable. So in our case, we get the SOC 2 because that's the branding some of our non-healthcare customers are looking for, and we get the HITRUST because honestly, that is what makes me feel good, and if we had anything less than that, I really wouldn't be able to stand in front of my customers and look them in the eye and say, we're doing a good job securing your information, and here's proof. Efficiency, ease to implement, and so from a HITRUST standpoint, our approach, 5 large health plans partner to convey consistent and easy to understand requirements, and among us 5, we actually had 7,500 third parties that this requirement went out to, and by aligning to SOC 2, HITRUST CSF has some applicability beyond healthcare. The requirement there is easy. There's no 16-page amendment to the contract that says here's the security requirements. It's you just have to go get HITRUST certified. The requirements get updated every year. Every 2 years, you have to go get recertified. We don't have to update our contracts every year because now there's a new cyber threat out there. That is all taken care of. From a coverage standpoint, we talked about having scalability, and we get to the top right corner, which is the number one thing I was looking for, and that is that for 100% of my third parties, I want to have an evidential review of policies and validation of every single security control. Why was it important for me to get to 100%? Because after years and years of trying, I still had very, very low confidence in our ability to accurately tier our vendors. And a vendor may start out small and low risk. 6 months, a year from now, the nature of that business relationship could change. They could lose their security team. They could defund their security. I'm not going to know what's happening. I'm not going to feel good about the tiering of my third parties. So I don't want to rely on that. I just want to assume that someone else is going to go do that for me. And by doing the HITRUST certification, I get that. If you're low risk, your control requirements are going to be low. If you're high risk, control requirements are going to be high. And I just want 100% of my vendors to be HITRUST certified. Otherwise, I don't feel comfortable going to my customers and saying, trust us, we're on it. The last thing that we looked at was, from a coverage standpoint, was adoption. The third party's desire to adopt due to perceived value of approach. And we got there because of the approach that we took, and back to the conversation that I had earlier, which is, it isn't something that we're doing to them. It is something that we have to look at both the side of the enterprise and the relying party and make sure it makes sense for everyone, because we're on both sides of it and we need it absolutely to make sense. And to date, the vast majority of our third parties see the value and approach and have committed to it. There's one vendor that it was escalated to me, and I had to have about 2 or 3 conversations with them to say, why aren't you getting HITRUST certified? And if you really aren't, let me know, because then we need to start making plans to stop doing business with you, because we were serious. And they came back to me in spring of this year and said they are going to go and get HITRUST certified, and they've already selected an assessor. So finally, if this is going to be successful, there's 3 things that are extremely important. One is it needs to have continued broad support across the industry. If this is something that's seen as Highmark is doing and 4 other payers are doing, this is going to fizzle away. And so at this point, there's probably close to 90 or 100 organizations out there that have done the same thing that the 5 of us did to begin with, and they have now required all of their third parties to be HITRUST certified. In fact, I have received letters and had to sign letters that were the same as the ones that I had sent when we started this program, where our customers are telling us we are now going to have to be HITRUST certified. Good news is we got HITRUST certified 2 years ago, so for once we're ahead of what our customers' expectations are. Organizations are convinced that it's here to stay. If they think that this is just the flavor of the month and it's going to go away, they're not going to make an investment in it. This is here to stay, and I can tell you that because I'm now starting to see a lot of demand and growth from financial services industry. And I'm starting to see it from the technology sector and for other areas where they aren't in healthcare, they don't have protected health information, but they're looking at this framework and saying, this is what we want to do and this is what we're going to use. And next year when the new framework comes out, you'll see a pretty significant change in the framework that's going to make it broader and not nearly as healthcare specific, and it'll become industry agnostic. And then the last piece is that both the relying parties and the third parties need to not only perceive, but they need to realize value. And if they're not realizing the value, the costs are going down, the audits are going down, the questionnaires are going down, it absolutely won't work. To date, we're seeing it work because organizations are seeing that. I just polled my team. In just the month of September, we had 3 questionnaires that we were able to go back to our customers and say, hey, we've got this HITRUST certification. Your questionnaire is down here. Our certification's up here. Do you really want us to respond to your questionnaire, or would you like the 300-page report from HITRUST based on an on-site audit that lasted 3 months? In all 3 of those cases, they said, forget about the questionnaire, just send us the report. That is value right there. Because guess what? Those those customers, when I complete that 100, 200, 300 question questionnaire, what do you think they have to do with it? They have to go through the results, and they have to go manage it, and they have to come up with a corrective action plan, and they have to do remediation, they have to do all of that work, or they could just say, give me your HITRUST report, which already has the corrective action plan, and I'll follow up with you in a year or 6 months. Now we've solved it, now we've reduced our costs. Okay, well, thank you very much.